Good morning, Deirdre.
Good morning, Tom. How are you today?
I'm great. So I'm giving you a very clear view of a location. Where am I?
Well, been spending some time, at least psychologically, on Cape Cod. So I'm guessing that we're back on Cape Cod here. Is that
We
right?
are.
Okay.
We
Yes.
are.
Yeah. Look at
Um,
that. Old Cape Cod type building, boats, and so forth. So.
and can you make sense of what that building might be?
Well, I think my initial reaction was it might be a lighthouse keeper's house, but could be a factory or a building of some.
Actually, you're really close, Deirdre. It's called the Twine House,
Ah,
and this is Chatham, Massachusetts. Clearly part of the import trade and then making twine
right.
and so forth. So anyway, great guess. And you can tell that fall is almost gone because the trees in the background are starting to be losing their leaves.
Very definitely.
So, what's the subject today?
Subject today is value exchange. We're continuing on this topic because it is just so critical. And I'm wondering, Tom, since you have a really good top level way of thinking about this, why don't you talk for a few minutes and then throw it to me and I'll start to get into some details and some examples. So go
So
ahead, Tom.
this isn't a setup. You're not setting me up to.
No, no, not at all. No,
Okay.
not at all. You have, as I say, a good way of approaching the subject.
Okay.
So go
So
ahead.
value exchange. So there are two subjects, Deirdre, that we think are really important that you have clear in your mind for doing anything. And that is the concept of value exchange in the game.
Mhm.
And so the game means whatever you're doing, and that game can be all the way from interacting with a dog on your morning walk through building a mega company that's global. Or it could be beginning an entrepreneurial company, founding an entrepreneurial company. It's about what are you doing? And one of the examples we use about the game is move into a new neighborhood and then put your children in school. You'll learn the game really fast. You'll learn who controls what, who is the influencer group, who are the major influencers, who do you need to get to know to be able to develop a relationship with to function and function the way you need to go. You've just described the game. What is value exchange? Value exchange is how you win the game or lose the game. Value exchange is the interaction that you're having with the other side, and you're investing something and you need something in return. And the example I think I've given you even before is as you were going down and approaching a dog, and the dog appears like it could have a little bit of anger in it or something. You're not sure what. What you want is you want peacefulness with the dog, right? You want to be able to get friendly with the dog because you want to be able to then pass through there on a regular basis and have a friendly relationship with the dog. The dog doesn't start out that way. Let's say that in one case, the dog's afraid. So you have to quell the fear. You're investing, and what you're looking for in return, that's the exchange. So you're trying to develop a value exchange. You could also decide very quickly there is nothing you're going to do that's going to change that dog's demeanor except make it worse. So you just politely and quietly turn around and walk away. And that's where you realize I am not going to be able to play that game in any way that I can immediately see. Value exchange is what are you investing and what are you getting back? What you invest is the concept that we commonly call a value proposition. So it's what you're offering to whomever you're offering it to in the game. And then the return is what you're getting back for that investment. By the way, it could be, as you and I've talked about, it could be that you invest your own personal time and capital into doing good works in the community, and you want nothing in return other than to see people living a better life. That's all you care about. And there could be even more distant. where you're investing your time and capital, and you never see the good works implemented, but you know they're happening. And you don't want anything in return, no recognition, no financial monetization, nothing. Your name in the paper, nothing. So that's what value exchange is, and that's the concept of the game. You're going to take it today, and you're going to take it and take it deep for us and to explain to us how this works and how the game is constantly changing because it is. And you and I know that's the one thing we know is everything changes, including yourself. And that applies to your business and the people in your business and so forth. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to you and I'll take a break and have some caffeine.
Okay. Well, you've done a good job of setting up the whole concept that value exchange isn't just something on a checklist that you say, now I'll establish the value exchange check. That value exchange permeates all aspects of what you do as a leader, as a business person, as making your business deliver the results it wants, whatever those results are. And then, as you've been pointing out, also how you go through life and so forth. And the game is a good organizing concept. I'll sometimes use the term context instead of game, but they all, both approach it from the same point of view. That remember a couple of days ago, we recorded a video that set out different types of value exchanges, the opportunity value exchange, the investment, and the institutional and leadership. I'm not going to define those in this video. People can go and look at our other video. But what we did do is start to talk about how the game, the context, affects whether you have a value proposition, which is the first part of the exchange, whether you can establish even one of the value exchanges, and then whether you can establish all three. Remember that I talk about the game as a chessboard. And on the chessboard, there are a number of pieces. And in business terms, these pieces are things like marketplace, competitors, customers, social factors, industrial factors, business factors, technologies, and so forth. And even when one move is made on one of those factors, then the whole game changes. You have to start thinking about the game differently. So too with the value exchanges. When the game changes, when the context changes, then you have to either adjust your value changes, at the very least, make sure that they exist, but more likely do a realignment of them so you continue to get all three of the value exchanges. That's the opportunity, the investment, and the institutional and leadership. Now, one thing always to keep in mind is that the stronger the change, the more important it is to immediately evaluate your value exchanges. If you see an emerging technology come out and all of a sudden it's getting a lot of space in the business press, you probably have to readjust your value exchanges very quickly here. Any sort of marketplace disruption like that, any introduction of new products, even sometimes just a change in functionality of a competitor's product can do it. So you have to be aware about everything that's going on in your marketplace so you can keep your value exchanges current and profitable to you, however you define profit, in the context, in the game you're playing. Now, this is easier to see sometimes in examples. So let me drift into an example here. And the example I've chosen is the bookstore chain, Barnes and Noble. It came to mind immediately because I've spent years of my lives in bookstores and love going into bookstores. Barnes and Noble was a large chain of bookstores operating both for the general public and as university bookstores. Frequently, the local Barnes and Noble was where you went for your textbooks and other materials. And they operated profitably and well for years and years. Then the game changed. This thing called Amazon showed up. And all of a sudden, people didn't have to go to bookstores to get things. Similarly, there was a shift in the textbook market where instructors were going not to a single textbook or maybe 5 books to read for a course, but they were using a range of materials. And at the same time, a secondary bookstore market arose for textbooks because they're so expensive. The average science textbook costs over $100 these days. So, of course, a secondary market will establish. I'm pointing out how so many of these things are just moves on the chessboard. Anything from pricing to the onset of new customers to changes in how competitors, uh, what competitors are doing in the marketplace, to how the products are used, and so forth. Any of these alone could change the game coming all together within maybe a 1 or 2 year period. They just slammed Barnes and Noble. So, so what Barnes and Noble tried to do, and this was the longtime owners, founders of the bookstore, is they tried to work along what I'll call standard business lines to reassert the primacy of Barnes and Noble. For example, they started making decisions that would affect store layouts. There's a Barnes and Noble downtown in the city I live in, where they decided to make the ground floor the child zone so that people could bring their children to it and play and read books and so forth. But what that meant for people like me coming in from the street into the store is all I saw was children's toys. This was no longer a bookstore. So for me, this may not have worked, may not have been the change wanted. At the same time, what they did is reduce inventory to mostly the bestsellers and the most popular books. And again, to someone like me who reads, more esoteric books or older books or things like this, all of a sudden, Barnes and Noble was not a place for me to go. And judging by the sales numbers, I wasn't alone in that. That a lot of customers stopped going to Barnes and Noble for one reason or another. And yes, Barnes and Noble did establish an online ordering process. And I'll point out again, everything I'm talking about here is a move on the chessboard, something changing in the context and the game. But even though they had the online ordering process, it became more of a habit for people to go to Amazon. They would go to Amazon. That's how you talked about ordering online books. You went to Amazon. Um, at this time, several bookstore chains went out of business, and there started to be talk in the business press about when will Barnes and Noble go out of business. And once that conversation starts, it's a change in the context here, and it changes the ability of an entity to function well. Then Barnes and Noble changed the game. And this is where it gets really interesting, Tom. The longtime owners and founders sold to a new owner. They sold to someone who had a reputation of knowing how to make bookstores profitable. Note the leadership exchange here, Tom. Very important. All types of exchanges here. This was obviously a big shift in the game, started by Barnes and Noble itself. And the new owner came in and started making changes. Each of these, another shift in the game in terms of the competition now out there. At the same time that these changes were made, the independent bookstores, the bookstores that were not parts of change, started themselves to make changes in the game or to establish their own games. They started to assert a new value. We may not have the inventory of Amazon, but what we have is atmosphere. We have a curated collection of books. We have armchairs for you to sit in. We have a little cafe attached. Come in with your coffee, meet your friends here, and see what books we have curated for you. And meanwhile, we will bring in authors to talk with you. We will start reading groups and so forth. So the independent bookstores themselves started to change the game. Now, think of the bookstore market here. I'm talking about the chains being disrupted, with a lot of them going out of business. a surviving chain, Barnes and Noble, getting a new owner and about to change the game. Amazon itself changing the whole bookstore ordering business. And then the independents running their own changes here. So the whole bookstore game is now completely different from what it was 10 years ago, even just 5 years ago. It continues to change like this. So back to Barnes and Noble and the new owner. One of the big changes they made is they decentralized the book ordering process. They wanted each individual store to have the ability to purchase the books that the book purchasers, book readers in the geographic location were most interested in. No more centralized ordering, and you must take the books that were ordered centrally. But you had discretion over the inventory of books in your store. At the same time, local Barnes and Nobles had gained discretion over layout. They could change the layout of the stores to match the layout that they thought local customers would want. And they also changed their inventory. They had a lot more flexibility in building inventory in certain areas. So now when I walk into the local Barnes and Noble here, I walk in, I see books. I see tables full of books, part of the layout changes. Yes, there's a children's section in the back there, and it's a nice children's section, but I see books. It's a broader collection. I can find books that I actually want to buy now. And these aren't necessarily bestsellers, but meanwhile, they do have the bestsellers featured on the upper level there. And it's a place where I want to go. I've started to go back to Barnes and Noble. And judging by the financial results, a lot of people are making these same decisions. The financial results are improving. The Barnes and Noble is almost becoming more like the independent bookstores, starting to do things that the independent bookstores are doing. There's a cafe in my local Barnes and Noble now. They have events there, bring in people. They welcome people coming in and just hanging out there. So it's become, again, more and more of a place people want to go. Then, a couple of days ago, I read something that Barnes and Noble is doing to change the game even further. They have an expansion plan. Now think about this. Just a few years ago, the business press was saying, oh, Barnes and Noble is going out of business soon. Now the new owner has an aggressive expansion plan. They opened about 30 new stores in 2023. Now, some of that might have been closing branches that were no longer sustainable, but in return, they opened 30 new stores in 2023, and they're on track to open 60 new stores in 2024. Think about this, how they're changing the game now. 60 new stores means that local bookstores in a lot of locations where there weren't local bookstores, extending value to a broadening and broadening audience of people who like what they're doing there. Now, there are value exchanges all over the place here in what we're talking about. We've seen how initially, when the game changed, the owners lost their value exchanges, and we're struggling a bit to reestablish value exchanges that the audiences wanted. Meanwhile, we have Amazon clearly establishing a new opportunity value exchange there. People could purchase a lot of books at a lower price. That's a big value exchange for a lot of people. You have the independents figuring out a new value exchange here. It's not only opportunity, it's institutional. The nature of the institution changed, and it became a more welcoming place to people. Then Barnes and Noble, under the new ownership, recovered value exchanges across the board. The opportunity value exchange was there. I can find books there that I want to purchase. The finances are working now, clearly. They have an institutional exchange where people are talking about what's Barnes and Noble going to do next? What new value are they going to provide? And they've got the good leadership. They've just made it right. In response to changes in the game, they changed the game themselves back and they have reestablished their value exchanges. Now, I've been talking for a while, Tom, so let me throw it back to you at this point.
So I think the interesting thing about Barnes and Noble is two things. Now, Deirdre, I'm assuming that they've listened to two of your favorites, right? You can get books now at Barnes and Noble, and you can get good coffee. I happen to know they now have good coffee, right? The
They do.
question is, are they providing wine and opera, your other major sins? Um,
Not yet, but I wouldn't expect them to. And that's actually an important point, that the value exchange has to be in terms of what the customer, what the marketplace wants. If Barnes and Noble went out and started to say, oh, we're selling wine in our cafe, that would not draw me in there because, but having coffee there does. That's just something to keep in mind. The value exchange
Absolutely.
has to have meaning for the marketplace and the customer.
It's what not only what you want, but what you expect, right? And that's the tricky part. But getting back to Barnes and Noble and building out Barnes and Noble, one thing that was critical there is you had a strong brand to begin with.
Yes.
It had brand equity. And there are really, really good investors who are investing in organizations that have strong brand equity, but perhaps haven't exploited it in the way that would um, would provide scalability.
Mhm.
And you were talking about Barnes and Noble had brand equity, had some good brand equity, but it was not making progress, and it wasn't really building on the value exchange with its client customers until new owners looked and said, "Here's how we can make changes to strengthen that value exchange with the customer within what they expect." Right.
Right.
Um, Two brands that I think of that are huge examples of that, Deirdre, are Filson and Yeti, where both of those companies were regional players. I remember when I was spending a lot of time in the Northwest, Filson was the company for outdoor gear and so forth. And then the high premium outdoor gear. And then Yeti was from Austin, Texas, and it was started as a cooler you could buy that was super duper that you use for fishing. And it was built by a local company. And both of those companies started building their brand out and did an outstanding job as local and to beginning to sort of scale around the country through mail order and then the online marketplace. But wow, when the folks that took over Filson and Yeti really did do the serious look at what does that brand hold in terms of the value exchange that I could create with a set of customers around the world. What could I do there? They've done
Mhm.
an outstanding job. And that's really just figuring out how much potential does that have? And this gets back to how you and I think about these things, that we think about the most important thing is what you're doing is useful. It's useful to the marketplace in some way, shape, or form.
Right.
Secondly, that we think in terms of scalability to whatever you want the scalability to be. So if you want to own your city or your town or your village or your county or your state or the world, you figured out how to scale. And it's hard to do those things no matter what the conditions are. And then the last thing is that in some way, you are receiving some form of satisfaction. It is a value exchange that you are have balanced in your mind. It's balancing your value exchange. For me, that's about sustainability, right? I
Mhm.
want what I'm doing to have long-term sustainability, and I figure out if I've got it, if it's useful, if it's scaling, and it's sustainable, it will give me back. Inherently, there'll be things that'll come back to me, right? That's just me personally. You can take that third one and figure out how, but that's all about your value exchange. What is your personal value exchange and how do you see it? And I know this is really esoteric words, but there's a concept here that I don't think we spend enough time on, which is what is the purpose of And you and I apply this to business, but we know it does exist all the way down to interaction with animals, right? Or even insects, right? It's it is this concept of value exchange. And in business, you can be very theoretical and you can say it is the purpose of business. It is the result. It's how you win. Because value exchange is not just financial. It can be purely satisfaction.
Yes.
So I'm going to stop now, Deirdre, and I'm going to turn it over to you. I've
Okay.
done enough on value exchange.
Well, remember that what we're doing in our whole deep business initiative, Tom, is helping leaders learn how to navigate the now. And this value exchange concept is increasingly important in this digital age that we've talked about in a number of videos. So maybe it's worth taking a moment to talk about how a leader has to prepare to establish a value exchange. Again, a value exchange isn't just something you can think about at a point when you're checking things off a checklist. You have to develop the business instincts, the business sensibility to be able to have a feel for these various types of value exchanges and understand how you build them, how you make the trade-offs, how you make sure things work, and how you can see when something is changing so that you have to change your value exchanges. And I think about it as say, a four-stage process, starting with things you and I have talked about. It's starting with the leader. Does the leader develop the mindset to do this work? Has the leader built the characteristics in the leader themselves to be able to do this work? In other words, leaders must educate themselves to be able to develop the instincts and the thinking to be able to do good value exchange work. Next thing they need is knowledge about the subject matter, about their industry, about their company, about the technologies being used in their company, about what the company itself wants to achieve, about how the company itself may have to change in the digital age and the transformation from the industrial to the digital age. Then there's the next part is what I'll call just general business. How does this thing called business work? What are the practices? How do marketplaces structurally work? How do customers structurally think? How can I work within the context of what business does, how business works, with the knowledge of my particular situation, and then with myself as a leader, having developed my instincts and my education, because that's what it comes down to, Tom, the
Okay.
instincts of the leader.
Yeah.
And then what that gives someone, those three things, is the ability to work with value exchanges. This has to be a fluid process. Now, you and I have talked over the years, and I know we'll be talking more about it, how things like reviews and assessments and adjustment processes have to be done more frequently than most. Can't be an annual process. We sometimes work at the week or the month level here. And what that means in practical terms is that leaders must be able to make the adjustments fluidly, agilely, to use a modern word. When something is off, when you see a change in the game happening, the immediate response is, how does that affect me? What adjustments do I have to make? Where is my game and the concept changing? And what does that mean for me? So I can continue to deliver on the value exchanges. And it may be time to move into another example here. And I'm going to talk about this hope hoping that the whole thing works out because, as you know, as I've already said, I'm a very avid reader and news consumer. And what we're seeing right now is the game shifting in the whole news business. This is not news to anyone. And people have been talking about this for 15 years now or so. And we're seeing in many cases old media, traditional media, starting to make some moves. But what we just had, for example, I'm going to jump right to the ends of this example to set it up and then go through the example step by step. is in the election that happened just 10 days ago or whatever. We had a discussion afterwards that one party relied on the traditional media and traditional processes, while the other party relied on the new processes, the new ways of influencing, the new outlets, and that it may have achieved its aims because it did that.
Mhm.
And the discussion is starting about now, how does that affect the whole game in the news world here? So let's go back to the beginning. Um,
Deirdre, it should be just to put a little context in. You're an avid. I'm sure everybody can guess this. You're an avid reader of both of all kinds of things, um,
yes,
not just books, but also the news. You're an avid reader of the news, and
right,
you actually lived in D.C. For an extended period. You live in and around New York City. You have a very strong pull toward the media. You understand the media, uh,
right,
and unlike me, I don't watch traditional media. I don't watch any much TV anyway, right? Almost everything I get is electronic, a different type of media. But you actually do. You read the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and all that stuff online. But you read all that, so you have an interesting perspective. And then
right,
I'm watching the other side, and you and I get to compare. And we do that almost every day. We didn't this morning because I was tied up with other things, but or even yesterday we didn't get a chance. But we almost every morning compare. What are you seeing? What am I seeing? And it's
correct.
fascinating. Uh, and
Absolutely.
so I think it's important for people to see this. The issue, what we're seeing right this moment is people are wondering about the value exchange, right? They're saying,
Right,
wait a minute, I invested all this capital, whether it be time, human resource, money, on one media, type of media, or I shaded in that direction,
right,
and I didn't win. Right? Whether we think that's right or wrong is not really the issue because we don't
right,
talk politics here. But but the question is value exchange.
right.
It's that you didn't win. And this is the point you and I make. All of this comes down to, I know it's a terrible name, but it's a terrible attribute, but it's called a game.
Yes.
And they didn't win the game. And now the question is, why? And what are the key factors of that? And you and I say I'm sure there are other parts of the value exchange that you and I don't want to particularly get into here, but the actual economic value exchange is pretty clear that it didn't work for them. Now, maybe it was the non-economic piece that didn't work. Maybe it was the actual value prop that didn't work. But that's what you're really talking about. You're just saying, look, two completely different approaches to the game, and one seems to have succeeded, the other did not.
Right,
If you want to win in this game, you have to not only you have to look at all aspects of the value exchange. And I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I think it's important that people understand you and I, we spend our time looking at both sides of this and trying to figure out. And now, why are we doing that? First of all, we're nerds. But secondly, but secondly, we're trying to understand where's it going because you and I, our whole purpose in being is to think about the future and how do we help leaders create the right value exchanges for their whatever they want to do,
right.
whatever it is, and that we help them with clear thinking and analysis to do that. So I'm going to stop and give you the remainder of the time, but I just wanted people to have that background that this is what the essence of these programs are that we're doing is to make sure that we all have the tools we need. By the way, opinions of two, right? Meaning we don't have all the answers by any means. It's just one more answer to think about.
Interestingly, what you and I have been talking about when we move to the very end of this whole situation is the fragmentation of the whole news marketplace. I'll mention, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, which are my first go-to sites in the morning. But, I get both print editions of them and online, but I tend to check the print first. But I do want to make the comment here that the news and the content in both is the same. What I mean by that, it's both made a good job, did a good job of translating the news, their newspaper, and their news operations into online versions. But it's by and large, or to the extent that I consume what's online from them, very much of the same sort of thing, which is fine for me and fine for lots of people. I know these online editions are very popular with readers, more popular than the print edition these days. But when you go to some of the online media, the news itself changes. There are more podcasts that are delivering opinions. There are more conversations. There's a more idiosyncratic view. You don't get the basic view across all of the news subjects that you would get, or that I get, and that I want to get when I look at online editions of the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. You get different content out there. And I think that's a factor that's going to continue to come into play. And it gets to the point of how people consume news. People listen to podcasts driving home after work. People listen to podcasts when they're on the treadmill at the gym and so forth. They're not looking at the newspapers or even the online editions of the newspapers. And so some of these other medias become proxy for the news, given the time that people have to participate in the absorption of news in the day. Now, an unfortunate aspect of this whole thing is that local newspapers are dying off. And it's unfortunate because the means of getting really local news is they're disappearing because most of the media are now becoming broad general media. It's harder and harder to find out what's happening in your town. And people are rightly saying that this means that a lot of oversight of local governments is disappearing. You don't have the reporters in there making sure that the mayor is doing what the mayor is supposed to do and so forth. And this is something that I think will be figured out at some level. It's a problem that needs to adjust, and the game will adjust here one way or another. This is an ongoing game here. So keep your eye out. It's not that what we have today is static, it's changing by the minute here. We know this. And I think what's most interesting for me to view, simply from a business point of view, is I see almost more change in the traditional media trying to figure out how to play in this new game. It may be that some of these new forms are happy in the forms they are, while the traditional media, to maintain their audiences, their revenue flows, the value exchange here, are trying to figure out how to play in the new ways while still maintaining the value that exists in their core today. It's a fascinating field to watch from the shift in value exchanges here. I haven't been saying as I've been going through this, here's a value exchange, here's a value exchange, but I think our listeners attuned to value exchange now are filling in for themselves how all of these changes are creating value for the different audiences out there, fragmented as it is, and so forth. So let me stop here and allow you to comment because I know you've got opinions on this topic.
So I think that there are two thoughts about this. One is that um, a lot of these a lot of the media that is what we would call the traditional media was created by professionals. By the way, many of them trained at our university, right? The School of
Correct.
Journalism at Columbia. Um, but they were trained, their purpose was to analyze, to sort, and then to present.
Right.
And it was because the same reason we saw that you and I built companies in data analytics, because uh, the source material by itself was overwhelming.
Right.
And you needed to find some intermediary that would make sense of it for you and digest it and provide you with the most important things. And we built a couple of companies around that. And what I think we're seeing is that technology is allowing through its power to deal with source material, raw source material. We're seeing that is what people are gravitating to. And that's why they want to pick and choose their own sources because they can now get at them, right? Where they don't need a professional to figure out this. And so, will there always be an element of people who are they're happy no matter what their age group, they're happy with what they have and they don't want it to change. I am positive, I even know somebody in my own family that I bet they're going to watch 60 Minutes till they die, or if
Right.
60 Minutes dies, whichever dies first. I mean, I don't mean that flippantly, but they just don't want change, no matter what it is. Um, Now, the essence here. Now, I want to go back to Yeti and to Filson. The question becomes: do these outlets that are in the main, what you and I would call traditional media, do they have a core of value that can be re-exploited by new owners who will identify that and build on that value? Or is it like one of the other bookstores instead of Barnes and Noble? It's like one of the other bookstores that just faded away because they didn't quite have what Barnes and Noble has. That's the value exchange thing. And so when you look at this today, and you look at there, I know at least two of the mainstream media outlets are on the market, and one has been being tried to be sold all summer long. I have been thinking value exchange here. Is there a core element that can be exploited in the future, right? Does it fit? And that's going to be the fascinating discussion and fascinating thing, and not from the point of view of will we see the long-term brand of media stream X. That's not the point. The point is that is there enough core value there, or has the game changed so significantly that those what used to have value doesn't really have value anymore? It's a hard argument. I would not want to take a guess right now, but what I would say is it's probably going to be a pretty significant makeover of some aspect of it, which I'm sure was some aspect of Yeti and some aspect of Filson and as you mentioned, you went through the makeover of Barnes and Noble.
So, the game is the broad context in which the leader acts, the individual acts, the company acts, and so forth. The value exchange is creating something that you give and something that you get in multiple ways, whether it's the opportunity, the investment, or the institution and leadership value exchange. And then it comes down to, from my point of view, how do people develop the ability to operate this way, to keep creating the value exchanges, to perceive core values, to make the changes needed, to reinstate and continue to create value exchanges? Well, it comes down to those things we keep talking about, Tom. It's the leader continuing to develop, gain education, build the mindset, develop the ability to work. And I think also leaders these days must be more actively engaged in the game in this digital age than perhaps leaders had to be back in the industrial age when things were more static. So there's this whole concept, which we haven't really talked about yet, of active attention and active action that leaders must be able to engage in and carry out to make the business, the game, and the value exchanges work for their organization. And maybe that's a stopping point for today, Tom.
I think it is. I think it is. I think we've run way over the normal time we like to do these, but it was important to cover the subject. I think we're seeing a change in the market I think we're seeing a significant change in the marketplace, Deirdre, and this means value exchange have to change. That's why you and I are doing this. We wouldn't be doing this if we thought this was going to be the status quo.
No,
Um, we think that there are a lot of people asking value exchange questions right now. They may not think about it the way you and I do, but they're asking big time value exchanges. Um,
exactly.
and that is so we wanted to take a moment to make sure that everybody has as sharp of a view of this thing as they can possibly get, at least by getting an opinion of two.
Exactly.
Okay, dear, it's
Okay.
great to see you.
And you too. So long for
Okay,
now.
bye.
Bye.